Not. I hit record. We are now recording, which reminds me I haven't updated the last one that we recorded because I recorded Thursday night. So, by the way, we actually finished Psalm 9 on Thursday night.
Oh.
Gordon and Nancy will testify to this. So, we did it. We did it. So.
Wasn't it here?
I know. That's all right. It's been recorded, and eventually it'll be posted.
There you go. I'll have to go back and watch it.
There you go.
Sorry, the blood drive was taking my time.
Oh, I understand. So if anybody does want to join us on Thursday nights, we're studying various Psalms. There's not a lot of rhyme or reason to the order that we're picking. It's more or less what people want to see or what I've kind of run across in sermon prep or other things. And so then I just kind of pick that up and we look at it. So if you want to join us, it's a fun little time. Great theology in the Psalms. Just great. Okay. So Genesis. Genesis is a very interesting book. The word Genesis itself is Greek in nature, meaning kind of to begin, right? Or to kind of the start of. And that's really a translation out of the Hebrew, the very beginning, the first word of the book of Genesis in Hebrew. It's going to be in the beginning. So in Rosh, there we go. That's the Hebrew for it. And that just simply means in the beginning. Every one of the first 5 books of the Old Testament in Hebrew have slightly different names in Hebrew than they do in Greek or in English. And that is because in the first 5 books, they are all simply the first words that are there. Because Moses didn't bother titling anything. Most of that is, as we talked about last time, the different technologies we can use, it's really hard to title a scroll. We don't always think about it, but it is really hard. And so if you just kind of mentally title it or in a society title it by the first words of it, you can pretty easily look, oh, there it is. Okay, now I can close it. That's the wrong scroll. Oh, wrong scroll. Oh, okay, there it is. We got the right scroll now. Now we can find it. So Genesis is about the beginning. There is a lot of material that has been written about other cultures and creation narratives. The biggest one that is often compared to the book of Genesis is and I got to open up my PowerPoint here because I want to make sure I pronounce it right. The Enuma Elish. And that's a Babylonian creation narrative. It pits Marduk as the kind of good god against Tiamat. They are kind of these two eternal powers, and the way that creation works in that account is Marduk and Tiamat fight each other to the death, and Marduk kills the great serpent Tiamat, splits her in half, and then half of her becomes the sky and half of her becomes the earth. And everything else kind of sprouts from there. Now, I tell you that because the story that you choose or the story that you follow, that is the beginning of how things are, sets the tone for how you see the world that you have. So if we look at it and say, okay, let's just follow this old Babylonian myth. All right, I know that that's not what we believe, but let's just play with this for a second, okay? What are some of just from the way I told you the story, what are some of the aspects of that story that stand out to you?
Good and evil.
Okay, good and evil are locked in combat, and they are both kind of major forces. Absolutely. What else?
There was the difference, the separation of the sky and the earth, right?
Yeah. The separation of sky and the earth, and they are both built out of something that was eternal or godly. So there's a divine nature now that we're playing with creation. Creation is divine in some capacity because it's built out of Tiamat.
And there's a serpent.
Okay, there's a serpent that plays out there. And so you have that mythos that you can begin to bring in. I forget what Marduk is by nature. I want to think soldier, but I know he has another kind of capacity as well. I just don't remember off the top of my head.
Laurel, I think she thought it was one of
I think if I remember
Timon's children.
no. Okay, so
Oh.
if I remember correctly from the mythology book All About Me in New York, Tiamat had like these children who were like the first, like the main pantheon of gods, and Marduk was one of those. And if I remember correctly,
You are correct.
it's been a while since I read the book, at least that section
Yep.
of it.
Yeah, Marduk, the great evil, has a bunch of children. She rules over all of them and enslaves them, and then Marduk raises up with his brothers, fights and kills her, and he becomes the chief god then. It's something we see happen in Greek and Roman mythology as well.
Yeah, Titans with Uranus, and then gods with Titans.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
There's a floating hand talking to you.
I see it. Yeah.
One of my favorite things. It's fun.
Let's see how much
Yeah.
farther we can shrink.
There you go. No, that's great. You're absolutely right, Lorelei. Those are additional mythologies that kind of tell that story. And so that's a major piece here, is that it's a rebellion, right? That the way that creation came into account was through a rebellion, was through the upheaval of one who was weaker conquering one who was stronger. And so you have a might makes right kind of morality that begins to be enforced here, that if you can win, you must be right, that your force, your power overcomes evil, or overcomes the enemy, whether or not they're evil or not. So yeah, these are all major things as well. Very good. And so how does this differ from the creation account that we have?
God made everything out of nothing.
Okay, good. That's a great place to start. So instead of taking something that was a divine, eternal essence of creation, God takes nothing and he simply makes things. Yeah, the Latin here is ex nihilo. God creates out of nothing. Now, how that whole process works, that's a discussion we'll get into, I'm sure, a little bit later. But for now, absolutely. We as Christians do not look at creation as divine. Something very different than these other mythologies that look at kind of the divine and human, and there is a very thin break between those, if there is any break between them. Even the Greek philosophers like Plato and others will look at creation as if it has an eternal capacity or an eternal value in it. We as Christians say, no, it's temporal. God made it, he's eternal, but he made this thing. It wasn't, now it is, therefore it's not eternal. And so it's a very different kind of starting point. We know that it's not going to last, so we don't necessarily try and make it last or get worried if it's not. Good. And other things?
Everything God made was good.
Yes, very good, Scott. Yeah, everything in the initial creation is good, even very good. It's not the product of rebellion. It's not the product of good triumphing over evil. You have good. You don't have evil introduced at all in the creation. So it is only good. And that's an incredibly important point there as well. And nothing is kind of corrupted in its original state. Nothing is at war with itself. Nothing is divided. Everything is unified. Good. Anything else? Yes, Theron.
Okay. So you've been able to answer all my questions so far.
Uh-oh.
Is the purpose of mosquitoes? If you claim that it was all good,
I got you. Theron? I'm gonna paraphrase from a very good preacher who preached in about the 5th century named John Chrysostom. Chrysostom is a Greek word. It means golden mouth. He was so good at preaching, his friends and contemporaries called him the golden mouth, and it stuck. So, I mean, that's the nickname he had. He deals with this question, right? He says, some things God created for the good of humanity, but all things he created for his glory. And so mosquitoes, I would say, fit squarely in simply God created them for his glory.
Not necessarily for the good of humanity.
Yep.
Maybe
You're a creature. God didn't make creation just because he wanted you to be happy and you know, be the center of attention. He's the guy. He made it for him.
He made it so dragonflies have something to eat. And
Hey, there you
dragonflies
go.
are cool.
So obviously,
Yeah,
God
see?
has never been bitten by a mosquito.
No.
I was bitten just the other day. Oh man. Yeah. No, it's the same thing, Theron. That question is actually, why did God make cliffs? What good to humanity is a cliff?
What?
Like a cliff top cliff.
Yeah, like you run off it and fall and die. Yeah.
but there's a difference between not being good for humanity and just being bad for us overall. A cliff is only bad for you if you're an idiot and run off it.
If you're a
Mosquitoes are only bad if they're biting you.
There you go. Or cliffs are to teach you about velocity.
There's always that too. There's always that too. But no, I think the initial, some things are for our benefit as kind of the crown of creation. Other things are simply made for the glory of God. And I'm okay with putting mosquitoes in that category because we can't always know. So, and I think it is to God's glory, as Scott said, to give the dragonfly something to eat because they are super cool. I love them. They fly around back here in the backyard. It's awesome. Just awesome. Okay, so we've been talking a little bit about just comparing Genesis and the creation account that we know pretty well to the creation account of the Babylonian people. And when you have those different accounts, you're going to have different values. You're going to have different emphases in how you look at the world, how you appreciate the creation, what you're going to see as part of, as intrinsic or as natural or other things like that. And so that's why Genesis really becomes so utterly important for us, is it sets the foundation for us to kind of understand what is this trajectory of creation. Are we going up? Are we going down? What is the trajectory of what God is doing? If you don't have that starting point and that kind of those basic assumptions that we're making about who God is and what he's doing, well, there's no way to kind of draw the line. The string never goes taut. You're just kind of always pulling it forward. So that's where Genesis becomes so very, very helpful. So like I said, there is a lot of ancient Near Eastern comparisons out there to the book of Genesis, the Babylonian one being the most well-known. Other ones are not quite as well-known, and we'll talk about more as we get into other things like the flood, where you get the Epic of Gilgamesh and things of that nature. So,
Every culture
okay.
is actually
What?
one of the really interesting things about like reading world mythologies is like pretty much every culture has some variation of a flood story, and like two people being chosen to make sure humanity survives and stuff. It's just kind of interesting that every culture has that. Like
Because it happened.
yeah, well, yeah, but it's just like one of the things that like you can definitely confirm it that because every culture has it, you can confirm that it happened.
Or because it was in the Bible.
Well, at some point, Noah's sons, right, went off their own separate ways. And yeah, I mean, they told the story. And, daddy and grandpa told the story to son, and the son told it to their son, to their grandson. And yeah, absolutely. Maybe some of the details, fell off in different, cultures and things. But you're absolutely right. That core narrative is there. And it is a testimony to what we have in the scriptures, the truthfulness there. All right. Well, that's kind of the beginning. The author of the human author of the book of Genesis is Moses. Moses is the first one to write down this material. Now, over the course of the history of Israel, others will come and edit Moses' work. Now, when I say that, I don't mean that they substantially change things, but I mean they add pieces and information so that the people who are reading it can understand. And that typically just gets incorporated into the text, because footnoting with a scroll is utterly impossible. Footnoting in general, people hate. And when you footnote, and so when you're doing it in a scroll and you kind of write on top of something, it tends to just get incorporated into the next one. Particularly, these things are seen in things like when places in Genesis are described as being near, say, Dan. Well, Dan's a tribe of Israel that doesn't have its land until after Moses is done writing. Right? Joshua has to take the conquest of the land. Then they get their land. And so all that is somebody else, probably Ezra, to be quite honest, as the final editor, Ezra the priest, going in and saying, okay, where was this? Where was this city? Where did this happen? Oh, there. Okay, that's where it was. That's why in Genesis you get a lot of these such and such place, which is also called such and such place, or is today known as this. That's an editor coming through. And again, I tell you that because this human editing doesn't change the theology that's there. It doesn't change what's going on. And again, I would argue that it's the Holy Spirit is at work making sure that this text is being used and forming people for the church and into a faith in Christ. And so we actually say that that's okay. We don't want to go off on the other end, which is a historical critical model, which takes the book of Genesis and starts ripping it into pieces, saying this guy wrote this and somebody else wrote that, and it's all just make believe. We aren't going there. So I just don't want anybody to get lost if I actually use the word editor and think that I don't believe in the scripture being inspired or something like that. So Moses wrote it. He wrote the first 5. He did so before he died, with the exception of the last part of the book of Deuteronomy. That got written by Joshua because it talks about Moses being dead. And Moses is good, but he's not that good.
So where did Moses get this information? Did he get it on Mount Sinai?
Yes and no. He probably received some from that. But if you go through the book of Genesis, you will see that in several places, I want to say the number is between 8 and 12 places, it will reference other material. So after we get through the first couple chapters, I think it's the first 4 or so, you hear about the testimony of the patriarchs. Actually, hold on. I've got a little cheat book here next to me that I was just looking at, and now I think it tells me. I can tell you the different places to look if I can find it. Ever been teaching, trying to find a page? This is that moment. Of course, now I won't find it because I said anything about it. But anyway, there are several places in which Moses will reference additional documentation. This happens not just in the books of Moses, but it happens repeatedly in things like the book of Judges or the book of Kings. They'll reference different prophetic books or other things. Here we go. Evidences of sources in the Bible. I don't have this one locked in. I'm sorry. Book of the Generations of Adam, Genesis 5:1. Sayings about Nimrod, Genesis 10:9. Sayings about the Mount of the Lord, Genesis 22:14. And there's a couple others there. So that's where Moses got it from. There's a large and long oral tradition by young earth people, historians, there's like a 4,000-year gap between Adam and Moses. Others, it could be much longer. And so you have a much wider kind of oral tradition that Moses is drawing on. And we would say, certainly affirm that when he was on Sinai speaking with the Lord for 40 days, would have had angels who were kind of assisting in, yes, put this part in. No, that story really didn't happen. Those sorts of things. So, and of course you have the Holy Spirit who's inspiring, right? Who caused holy men to write. And so at the very most basic, even if he heard nothing from mom, dad, and Grandpa Levi, he would have the Spirit who can inspire in thought, word, and in deed. So there's my answer.
Thank
I
you.
pulled it from a lot of tradition and stuff. But again, that actually is a really helpful point, again, that Moses is not making it up. He's hearing it from his brothers and sisters in the faith in Israel who have had these stories passed on. Actually, one of the places where we would say that this is pretty clear, Luther actually makes this comparison, although he doesn't draw the point quite strongly enough. Lorelei, you were talking about the flood narratives.
Can I have the
Now, of those people, we know that that Noah has 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, and that Shem is the one through whom the Hebrews will eventually come. He is the one who is kind of the faithful son. And there is a tradition that rises up that Shem is given the name Melchizedek. So that and this is important when you get to the story of Abraham, because Abraham will come down, he'll meet Melchizedek, and he'll say that he's a priest of the Most High God, and they'll kind of talk through this faith that they have. And Luther makes the point that why would Abraham, who's seen God almost face to face, listen to anybody except for someone like Shem, who was there on the boat, right? Who had seen what the world was like before the flood and who could carry that story on. And this happens throughout the scriptures. You have parents who tell children of the faith. That's why Deuteronomy says, so much about parents telling their children, because that's how the narrative has been passed on for generations and centuries, even millennia at that point. All right. Good on that. Let's see. We've got author of Moses. Time frame is somewhere in the desert. So we've got like 40 years or so of wandering. Most people will put the date roughly at 2166 BC. That's pretty close to the time frame of when Israel's in the desert. We don't know if he wrote Genesis on day 1 or on day whatever 39 years and some change is. But somewhere in there, he wrote these things. And then he had them read. Israel read them, and they became part of the holy tradition and books of Israel. Israel recognized that this was their faith. That's another important piece, is that when Moses is the author, he writes these things, and they're not rejected. Nobody kind of comes out and says, no, that didn't happen. Here's what really happened. And so you get Genesis 2.0 or something like that. You get the story of creation. You get the story of the patriarchs, which Moses retells for the people, and they accept it because that's the story they've heard. That's the story they know. So it's a kind of if anybody was going to reject it, it would be those guys, because especially when you get to Exodus, it's their story. So if he was making it up or said something that didn't happen, it would be very easy for others to have come alongside and say, no, it's not how it happened. Okay, good. What do you guys want to know about Genesis? Because Genesis is a huge book. I am happy to kind of go through various sections with us for the next week or 2 weeks or however long we want to go through Genesis, because there's a whole lot in there. But we can start tonight simply by, what kind of questions do you have? Since we're supposed to be talking about background stuff. But we can dive into the text, absolutely. All right, somebody's got to come up with the question, because I got an itchy nose and I want to itch it off camera here.
So if everything was good, then how did we get the tree of good and evil and an evil serpent?
Jeff, why do you ask such tough questions? Come on, man.
We're here to challenge you.
Oh my
Keep up with
goodness.
Aaron.
No, this is ridiculous. This is ridiculous. Okay. So Moses, how do I say this? I don't know if the tree was called by the Lord the tree of good and evil immediately. I think it's certainly after the fact is given that title, right? But I would say it probably isn't given a title at all, right? You can eat from any tree in the garden except for, right, the trees in the middle. Because I think we need to define what is evil in comparison to good. How do we want to define that?
Wasn't it just the knowledge of good and evil? I mean,
Sure.
how to tell the difference, right? And,
Sure.
and so was there evil existing, just not in the world?
Well, I think that's the question. We have to define kind of what do we want to define as evil? What's our definition?
Well, as the serpent was twisting God's words and tempting her, we would define it as evil
Yeah.
because he was lying and, all that subtlety.
Yes.
Yeah, but then she tempted Adam, so she's evil.
Yes.
There you go. But
Yeah.
yeah, right though, in chapter 2, verse 17, it says, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the gnosis of good and evil, the knowing of, or the comprehension even of good and evil. We could talk about, it could be that there was no comprehension of evil, that such things, existed. Evil was there, but was not kind of comprehended within the goodness of creation. How could such a thing occur? Everything is good, right? It's like a child who sees everything as perfect until something goes wrong. You kind of have that naivete. That's how some have looked at that. I'm not quite sure on that, and I want to go that way. Ancient philosophers have talked about evil in the same way that we often talk about cold. Allie, you're an engineer, right? Okay, how does cold work? What is cold?
Like the absence of heat.
There you go. Yay, I asked a good question. I'm so happy. I don't try and put anybody on the spot, but that was a little more difficult. So thank you, Allie. That was very good. Yeah, it's the absence of heat, right? Cold is the absence of something. We often talk about it as a thing. I'm cold. It's cold outside. But really what we're talking about is the absence of something. And there is a way in which you can look at and say that evil is the absence of good. So you can have good, and kind of the further away you get from it, the more space, the more absence that you introduce there. If that makes some sense? At least a way of defining kind of good and evil as an absence of good. And so what would be the knowledge of good, or the comprehension of good and evil in that case? That kind of all things are good, and that if we take God away, if we step outside of how it was created, then evil would be there. If we lose the good, evil now occurs. So I mean, that's more how I look at it, Jeff. in terms of, what is this tree doing there? I think that everything was good. Evil existed only insofar as good could be removed. So if we could draw it out, right? And that, I think that bears out, particularly in how Satan deals with the word of God there in Genesis 3, that he draws out, right, and makes it empty. He adds things so that they are not the purity of what God has said, but he creates this empty space. He makes what was good evil.
Does that work inversely?
Yeah. That you can smash together and make good?
Or that evil is, or like heat is the absence of cold?
Do you
No.
see? No, because you add heat to something and increase the speed.
In that case, heat is the thing, and the absence of the thing, the negative of the thing, is what cold is. So cold doesn't have any process to it. Like we could say, evil has no substance to it. It's simply the absence of something. It's the absence of good. So you can't get from that. You can't go the opposite way on that because you have a non-substantive thing becoming. At least I don't know how to do that. I should say it that way. I don't know. Baron, I know. I don't know how to do it. Sorry.
Okay. I was just curious if it worked the opposite. Yeah.
Not in anything that I've seen or kind of tried to have really thought about. It tends to be from the positive is the substantive thing, the substance, and then evil or whatever the negative side is the lessening of or the removal of that thing. Like if we're looking at today and there being all these people who are crying out for justice, right? But they are doing so, they're looking for justice, which is a good thing, right? But these calls seem empty because they aren't seeking ultimate justice. They are seeking anger, violence, all these other things have kind of come in and either polluted or emptied what this thing should be. And so now we are seeing evil and not good. Because a cry for justice is a good thing. A cry for justice that's burning things to the ground is probably not.
So Pastor Jeff had a second part to his question. What about Satan? When was he?
Yeah, I know.
I didn't want you to forget.
Yeah, I know, Dan. I know.
Dan.
Can we get a puppet show on this? Where did Satan come from? That would be
He's in the drawer of the puppets. That's where he is.
So,
if God created everything, then God had to create the devil, right?
yes.
Everything that God created was good.
Yes.
It was.
So here's my answer again, Jeff, is that I don't know perfectly. Okay? But God has not granted me this wisdom as much as I have asked for it, because I get asked this question more often than not. I don't have a good answer as to why he created him. Initially, he created him good. We know from the scriptures that he sinned. I take it to be a sin of pride that caused him to fall and ultimately pit him against the Lord. If I can use this idea that we've been talking about of kind of good falling away into evil, or no, set that aside. I'm not going to use that idea. This is the way that I've kind of talked about it with other people when I've taught on this. Here's what I think may have transpired, or at least helps me to kind of understand how did Satan, a good and powerful angel, become this source of great evil, or at least this murderer, as the scriptures call him. He has no power in and of himself, but anyway. His name in Hebrew, Satan, Satana, it means accuser. And we see in the book of Job just what he's supposed to do. And that is, he's supposed to take parts of creation or peoples of creation and reveal their sin, their failures before the Lord. He is to be the prosecuting attorney, if you will, in the courtroom of God. That's what he does to Job. For whatever reason, I think at the beginning of creation, as God kind of lays out, this is what I'm doing. Look at what I have made. Look at man, right, and woman who I have made. All of this is good, right, and salutary. This is fantastic. They are my beloved children that I have made. And I think the accuser doesn't think they're worthy of God's love. And so I think he accuses, he takes it upon himself to show God as the accuser how unworthy they are of his love.
So are angels in existence before creation?
No.
Because I mean, the Bible just says that God, the things that God created on the world, in our world, are good. It doesn't say anything about when he created angels, or at least I don't think it does, or or why some might have been evil, right? But everything in the world is good, but we know nothing about the rest of the universe at that point.
Well, we know that all things that were created and are kind of testified to in the 7 days, or in the 6 days, are good, even very good in the sight of the Lord. And so that is light. That is, in kind of generalities, light, sun, moon, and stars. There's not a specific time frame in there where it says, and he made angels. I tend to put the creation of angels somewhere around verse 3 of Genesis 1. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. This is a time, quite literally, the creation of time. I think this is also probably the creation of kind of the spiritual forces, the institution of knowledge. There's a whole lot that the church has kind of thought about in here. But you're right, Scott, we don't have a firm spot. But the church has been pretty uniform in saying that what Genesis describes is the box of all things, physical and spiritual, that have been created outside of the divine himself, because he's uncreated. So somewhere in there, we have to put angels. Now we can stick them in there at Genesis 1:1 or Genesis 1:2, that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth was void and without form. So before we ever get to the light and the dividing and the separating, there are angels. And so,
I mean, I can sort of picture, angels being around before creation, and then God embarks on this project of creation, and then Satan sees this, and now God has focused his attention on us, and Satan's a little jealous.
Yeah, and that's some of the fathers would talk about that as an act of pride that caused him to fall. The divine heart, turning away from his beauty to other things lesser. We don't get a whole lot in here, and a lot of the angelology, to use that phrase. It's, if you want to look up more stuff about angels, Jeff, it's angelology. You're going to find that you're going to be kind of traversing yourself through a little bit here in Genesis. You get some in Revelation, but it's not that helpful. You get Daniel has a little bit on angels. You get some stuff from Jesus, as he says, I saw Satan fall from heaven. Stuff on Job, a little bit in the Psalms. But you end up with bits and pieces. The Bible is a book of stories, right? A book of the stories of God and his people. It's not a book, unfortunately, for some of the more systematically minded among us, where we can go and find section A and then find angel and then find angelology and have everything listed out for us. But if this is a deep question, I am happy to get some of the various resources I have in the office and have a fuller, I can put something together and kind of have it for you next week. Talk a little bit more about it. But
I have a question.
Yes.
It kind of goes along with his question, but so I was wondering, like, what was God doing before creation? Like, how he's saying kind of like, you don't talk about angels being created, but I guess, I mean, it's,
Preparing a place for people who ask questions like that.
like, there's no way to know, right? Like, I mean, he always has been, and there's
Yep.
no way to know how long it took before creation or.
Yeah, we don't have any, all we know is kind of, I often will talk to my confirmands when we get to talking about creation as a shoebox. So we live in a shoebox, okay? You can measure all sorts of things. You can find all sorts of truths out about the shoebox, all right? It has one end, which is the beginning of the shoebox, and you have another end, which is the end of the shoebox, and that's kind of the realms of time. And then I can say, okay, well, imagine you're a Lego person, okay, and you've come to life, you're inside this box, you can find all this cool stuff about it. Tell me where the box came from. And they can't, right? Once you're inside the box, there's no way to get outside, right? That's what we want to do. That's what your question is how do we get outside of the box to look at it? Because if we can look at it, then we can study it. And we can figure out, oh, hey, it goes on further this way, or there's another shoebox down the street, or whatever the case may be. So we only know where the shoebox came from because God came inside. He opened up the top and shared that information with us. That's divine revelation. And so unless he divinely reveals, 14 years before I created the heavens and the earth, I was playing poker with, the word and the spirit, and those cheating guys made a bet and I had to create the world. We'll never know. Which, Lord, please don't strike me dead for making a joke about you and the sun. I know you wouldn't cheat at poker.
See what I started, Pastor?
I know.
But
If I'm not here next week, it's because Pastor blocked me and didn't let me in the chat.
but he has to cheat because he's omniscient, so he knows what everybody else has in their hands.
Yeah, they're just playing Indian poker at that point. They're just having fun. Absolutely. No, this is a good. It's a great set of questions, Jeff. And if I'll say this, there was great wisdom in the rabbinic tradition of the Jewish faith that much of the early church accepted, but unfortunately over the years has been lost. And that is this. There are several places in the scriptures that you really shouldn't worry about studying intently until you've been a Christian for a little while. And this is one of those places. Kind of the first creation story, the hexagomenon, the 6 days. This is one of those places that comes as we mature in the faith, not as a first step, but as something that we mature into. Because it has so many bells and whistles, because it is ultimately so foundational, and it has so many of these other pieces that we need to talk about. So it's a good question. I don't begrudge you at all asking it. In fact, I knew it was going to come up. If not you, it was going to be Dan. If not Dan, it was going to be my dad. Somebody was going to ask. Okay. So that's just fine.
Dan?
What was that, Theron?
Did you just say Dan?
Yeah.
Yeah. Over here. I got a Dan here, and I got a Dan down here.
Oh, he's talking about those Dans.
Yeah.
Why were you pointing at me?
Because if it wasn't for Jeff or Dan, it probably would have been you.
Absolutely.
So don't
Absolutely.
worry, Jeff. He hasn't kicked him out of Bible study yet.
Hey,
No, these are good. These are good questions. And again, it's a place where we have to be able to tell people, this is what we know, this is what we think, and this is what we don't. And it's okay to not know things. We seek those mysteries out together, and some the Lord may grant us to know, and others he may never. So Allie's question may never be answered. He may simply say, nope, I'm God and you're not, and I get to have who I am, and you don't. Okay.
Pastor, getting back to the Satan question.
Uh-oh. What?
When Satan fell, I mean, prior to that time, isn't it said that the angels had free will? And then after he led the rebellion, then God took that away?
Yeah, they're confirmed in their choice. Yeah. Yeah, it's a weird, kind of a weird set of things. He kind of just, for whatever reason, allowed them to have the ability of a will, and then seemingly he has bound their will. So angels have a bound will, either bound ultimately to the Lord now or bound against the Lord. We would say that humanity is in much the same way as the fallen angels. Our will is bound away from God because of our sin. We have turned away from him, and only by the working of God does our will turn back towards him. But yeah, I don't have a good answer as to why he allowed that. You get some of that in Daniel, some of that in Revelation as well, that they are now bound by their choices. So again, we don't get a whole lot on angels, mostly because they are the messengers of God. They're not that, they're cool, right? We all like superhumans and superheroes. So we like them for that aspect because they're super, strong and mighty and flash around and things. But they aren't that important in terms of the story that the scriptures are trying to tell, because they're wanting to tell about what God has done, what we have failed to do, and what God is doing to bring us back to him. It's not really a story about angels. I wish it were. I mean, that would be really cool. That can be a puppet show.
There's a challenge, Dan.
That's Dan.
Baron, you can help.
Okay, I'm Joey.
Oh my goodness. I can see that I've already created a monster. I can see the wheels literally spinning.
Wait, Dan, when are we gonna do that Cain and Abel one?
We'll talk, Baron.
Okay.
Oh no. Oh no.
You have all the puppets at your house, right?
I have some.
Okay.
He didn't want them to get lonely. Okay, good stuff. What other questions that don't have to deal with Satana, the accuser, the tree in the middle of the garden? Anything else here on the very beginning of Genesis? Let's just leave it to the first 3 chapters here. Any other questions on that?
I think he's looking for a beach ball.
I left that at church.
In the
mentioned
present day,
evolution.
in the present day world, where is the Garden of Eden thought to be located?
Oh, that's a great question. We don't
that-
have any idea. Lots of people want to try and just put it on the map near Israel today because they have some sentimental value towards that. And because there are some rivers, in the scripture it talks about 4 rivers converging in the garden. One of them being the Euphrates, another being the Nile, another being the Tigris, and I forget off the top of my head what the other one is. But 3 of those or so are kind of in the main ancient Near East area. So somewhere in there is where people like to, what's now all desert. People like to kind of place it there. But really you have the, obviously the flood kind of redefining the natural landscape. So where it is, I'm not really sure. You also have this wonderful phrase in the book of Genesis, which is, in the days of Peleg, the earth moved, which many take as a discussion of continental shift, of kind of, they often will many scholars look at the earth as kind of Pangea, right? The great mass of continents all put together, the land all together, the sea all at the sides. which makes some sense when the Lord says, to the waters, come thus far and no further. There's only one boundary around the whole thing, and the land is right there in the middle. But in the days of Peleg, the earth moved, and that's where some biblical scholars will say we get the continents and those drifts and things. So I can't tell you. Maybe it's here in Milford. Maybe historic Milford is really where Eden was.
So it makes sense that if it's
Yes, Theron.
Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, and then the one other were all there, and the Nile's way over here compared to Tigris and Euphrates.
Okay, they're having a discussion there.
It kind of, Lorelai is making sense of your 4 rivers and the.
So I have a small theory that I don't think is correct.
Welcome to the club.
Okay, but like the 40-day flood and everything with Noah.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody knows that. Well, say Pangea was actually just like the whole world was covered in Pangea, and when the flood came, it covered up everything, and when the flood water went away, 70% of it stayed, and that's the 70% of the world that's covered in water, and whatever places that the flood water went away is now the continents. Does that make sense at all?
Could be. There got to be a little bit of water because there is water that's created on the surface. But yeah, there's no reason that it couldn't be that some of the waters from the depths that opened or the depths from above that came down would not have or could not have remained in greater amounts and not gone all the way back. So there's no reason that couldn't be a possibility. I don't want to run with it too far. That's the thing about such biblical theories, Theron, is that we hold them loosely.
Listen to what he's saying to you. Where in Genesis is it about Peleg?
You were going to ask me that. I want to say it's...
People know.
Give me 1 second. Yep, I was right. It's Genesis 10, verse 25. And to Heber were born 2 sons. One was Peleg, for in his days the earth was divided, or the earth moved, and his brother's name was Joktan. His dad, Peleg's dad, Heber, is where we think the term Hebrew comes from. Because we don't have a good etymology of where Hebrew comes from. We think it's there. And then everything breaks down into the garden, into the Tower of Babel and whatnot. There you go.
Cool. Thank you.
You're welcome. I'm glad to have known some little factoid. All right, good. Anything else for our time this evening? You got time for another one, even if it's a Jeff-like angel question. No, you don't become an angel when you die. That would stink. That would be boring. You are made once lower than angels. Now through Christ, we have ascended with him to higher places. For no divinity ever chose to unite itself with an angel, but divinity united itself with humanity and has raised us up in greater glory than them.
Don't angels get wings, though? That sounds like it would be fun.
You better be ringing some bells then. Sorry.
Bell.
That's all right. I was thinking the same thing. I was going with the miracle.
It's a wonderful life.
Hey, at least he got it.
My youngest is trying to tell me why he's out of bed here.
Ah.
Go back to bed, Gideon. Okay. They are all perturbed, by the way, that we are still not doing nightly devotions and are back to our normal, what we did for like 6 years of Noah's life, we did nightly devotions as a family. And for 2 months here, we did devotions with all of y'all. And they just are flummoxed now. It's crazy. Okay. Well, I think that there is certainly more than enough in Genesis. So I'm going to leave this to the group. Do you want to talk more about Genesis? We can get into Cain and Abel. We can get into the fall. We can go into other things than just this creation narrative. We'll kind of leave that behind. But we can talk more about Genesis next week. Or if you want background on other books, you can tell me that now. I'm going to make you tell me now because nobody emails me.
I'm actually curious about the timing, because I know some groups put things at like an even 6,432 years because of the time of, they added all these things.
Yes.
So I'm kind of curious how that fits.
Okay.
I don't want to say this. The Lutheran narrative. You know what I'm saying?
We don't have a Lutheran narrative.
Oh, okay.
There's like 4 Lutheran narratives.
Oh, okay.
Nobody agrees. That's the problem. So, should we do Genesis next time too? Okay, that's what I'm seeing.
Sure.
Yep.
All right, Linda, I can answer your question here, but briefly.
Okay.
And if you want more, we'll talk more next time. But
Stop.
Don't swear while he's recording.
what, do I have to scrub this whole thing? I can't go back and do this.
Well, I just found out that our cat just caught a mouse, or is trying to.
It's always something in the priest household.
That's what cats do.
I know. So here's how I look at the whole kind of. There are 3 ways in which the church has historically looked at the book of Genesis. And I say historically because I mean across the whole history, not like the fathers did it this way. Either you have a young earth, which is somewhere around 6,000 to 8,000 years old, maybe 12,000, depending on how you want to read the word generations. You get an old earth. An old earth is going to be somewhere around 100,000 years old, because you start playing some games with, well, what does the father of really mean? Is this a generational thing? Is this a, exactly one son, or is this, a couple down the line? Kind of like what Matthew does in his narrating of Jesus' patronage. Right? When we go through the list of who is Jesus, who's related to Jesus, you get 3 sets of 14. It didn't work out historically. It's 3 sets of 14. That's stylized. So some have argued that of Genesis, that it's a stylized form. So they get to about 100,000 years or so old. Others will just take the kind of scientific evolutionary path. And so you get however many billion, trillion years we are at now. I have no idea what we're at. I don't subscribe to that one. Those are the 3 major ones. I tend to sit between the old and the new earth and old earth, somewhere in there. I don't have a good hook on the numbers. I tend to read Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 as the creation event in total. So God created the heavens and the earth. They are an invisible mass of stuff. That's kind of how Augustine will describe it. And then look at Genesis 1:3 and following in Genesis 1 as God's arrangement of creation. And that arrangement happens over, I think, probably 6 24-hour days. But I don't have a good time frame in terms of moment of creation to days of creation. Right? So God, and the words in Hebrew for creation in Genesis 1 versus the words that are used in Genesis 3 and 1:3 and following are different. So you do have some linguistic keys there, but there's a little bit of a difference there. But it's a possibility. I'm not not one who's ever going to throw stones at somebody. Says, no, in 6 days, in total, that's it. And Genesis 1-2 is some kind of a catch-all. Okay. I tend to read it a little bit differently. But that's the best that I can do in terms of a dating system for you, is that we don't know 6 days, and then we can kind of start counting. But I think years are years. I think days are days when it comes to the scripture stuff. So I don't think there's any kind of weird, some will argue like a weird dating, like a year is really only half a year or a quarter of a year. So you get these 900 years way down to get a young earth.
Powder was no use at all. So don't expect to anytime soon.
But anyway, I don't have a much better answer to that. I tend to put us somewhere in between the 60 and 16,000 range, somewhere in there. Yeah.
I was just curious because I know, like you said, some are very literal where we are, we counted from day one and this is what it is. And I don't know that you can really do that.
Yeah, there's.
But I also have a hard time with scientists when they go, this is exactly what the earth looked like 14 billion years ago. And I'm like, you weren't there. I have a hard time with that one. So
I just remind them that they're inside the shoebox at that point.
There you go.
And when you look at Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 as the creation event itself in total, so that all things are created, they are a mass of whatever at that point, invisible, undifferentiated, just matter. A whole lot of time can occur between that and day one. Day one is when time exists. Day one time, as we know, it doesn't exist before that because you have to have light to have time because of how we define and look at things. So
I actually also heard a scientist that believed in God, that he can subscribe to an extent to the Big Bang Theory, because if God said, let there be light, why wouldn't there be a Big Bang? But then I have a hard time with the whole, everything evolved completely, but.
Yeah, and that's actually a good, that'll be a good segue for us to next week in terms of evolution, because you have to deal with death. And that's what we'll deal with kind of next week when we talk a little bit about Genesis 3 and sin and the role and function of death. What is it for us? What was it then? Because that's what we have to deal with evolution, I think. So what is death and its role?
Cool.
All righty. I'm going to hit the end book call button so that I can spend the next 2 hours letting this process our video recording. And hopefully I'll post it on the website. Thank you all for being here, for indulging me in this. I just love you guys and the study of the Word. I love going through. Genesis is so much fun. As much as I give Jeff and Dan a little bit of a hard time on these things, these questions are great. These are the fun things to deal with, far more fun than some of the stuff you deal with in Corinthians. So I'm glad to be here. And so you guys all have a blessed night, and go be glad to be wherever you are with whoever you're with during this quarantine.
Yeah.
Thanks, Pastor.
Bye. Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
See ya.
Right.